The horseman arrived at a gallop, his uniform torn and his face gray with dust and something worse than exhaustion. It was the afternoon of January 22nd, 1879. At a small mission station on the Buffalo River in southern Africa, a British garrison was going about the routine business of an army supply post. Men moved crates between the storehouse and the hospital. Engineers checked the pontoon bridge crossing. Wounded soldiers rested in their beds. It was the kind of quiet afternoon that follows a morning of uneventful labor. Then the rider came in, and the quiet ended. His message was simple. The camp at Isandlwana, 10 miles to the northeast, was gone. Gone in the way that left nothing standing and almost nobody alive. More than 1,300 British soldiers and Allied troops had been killed in a single morning by a Zulu army that swept out of the hills and did not stop. And now, the messenger said, a force of several thousand Zulu warriors was moving this way. The station was called Rorke's Drift. It was a crossing point on the Buffalo River, a small square of mission buildings and supply crates sitting in open country near the border between Natal and the Zulu kingdom. It had a hospital inside one building and a storehouse inside another. The garrison that remained to defend it numbered roughly 150 men, including 35 patients who could barely walk. The first thing the senior officers did was try to make a decision. Lieutenant John Chard of the Royal Engineers and Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead of the 24th Regiment of Foot called the meeting. The question was whether to run or to stay. Running meant loading the wounded onto wagons and moving through open country with no escort and no speed. Staying meant building a wall between two small buildings and hoping that it would hold. It was Acting Assistant Commissary James Dalton, an experienced former sergeant who had spent years in the Army before moving to supply work, who made the argument that settled the matter. A slow column moving across open ground with hospital patients would be run down and destroyed in the open, where there was no cover and no defense. The post, at least, had walls. There were 20,000 rounds of Martini Henry ammunition in the storehouse. The Martini Henry rifle was one of the most accurate and powerful weapons in the world. If they stayed, they had something to work with. The officers agreed. They would stay. What followed was 2 hours of furious work. To understand what was coming toward Rorke's Drift, it helps to understand where the Zulu kingdom stood in January of 1879, and how it had ended up at war with Britain in the first place. The Zulu kingdom was not a primitive polity stumbled upon by colonizers. By 1879, it was a sophisticated military state with a disciplined army organized into age-grade regiments called Amabutho. Warriors were grouped by age, trained together from youth, and lived and fought as units of the same cohort. They carried cowhide shields and stabbing spears called iklua, and they moved with remarkable speed across difficult terrain. A Zulu impi could cover 30 miles a day on foot and arrive ready to fight. The kingdom was ruled by King Cetshwayo Kampande, a capable and cautious leader who had spent years navigating the growing pressure of British expansion in southern Africa. Cetshwayo's policy when the war began was fundamentally defensive. He had ordered his armies not to cross into Natal, the British colony to the south. He wanted to defend Zululand, not to conquer new territory, and he hoped that 1 or 2 sharp defeats might convince London that the cost of pressing further was too high. The war itself had been provoked by Sir Bartle Frere, the British High Commissioner for South Africa, who delivered an ultimatum to the Zulu in December of 1878 that was designed to be impossible to satisfy. Among its demands was the effective dismantling of the Zulu military system within 30 days. The British government in London had not fully authorized this ultimatum and was not particularly eager for a war. But the ultimatum went out anyway, and when Cetshwayo could not meet its terms, 3 British columns crossed the border into Zululand in January of 1879. The main British force under Lord Chelmsford was confident. Overconfident, as it turned out. At the camp of Isandlwana, the British had left their soldiers in an unfortified position with gaps in the defensive line and ammunition crates screwed shut with tight bolts that slowed the rate of resupply. When 20,000 Zulu warriors appeared on the surrounding hills and swept down in the classic encircling formation called the chest and horns, the camp collapsed. By early afternoon on January 22nd, the camp was destroyed and the vast majority of its defenders were dead. It was the worst defeat a modern British army had suffered against a force without equivalent European weapons. The news would not reach London for weeks. But it was already moving toward Rorke's Drift in the form of several thousand warriors who had not yet drawn blood. The men at Rorke's Drift had roughly 2 hours to build something that might keep them alive. The mission station consisted of two single-story stone buildings about 90 feet apart. The western building had been converted into a hospital for sick and wounded soldiers. The eastern building was being used as a storehouse. Between them, and around the yard that separated them, the garrison had to build a wall. They used what they had. The storehouse held mealie bags, which are large sacks of dried corn, each weighing close to 200 pounds. There were also wooden crates of biscuits and tinned meat. Working at speed, the men stacked these into a chest-high perimeter connecting the two buildings, looping around behind the storehouse to form an enclosed yard. The walls of the buildings themselves were punched through with holes, called loopholes, so that soldiers inside could fire outward without exposing themselves. Chard and Bromhead also built a second internal wall of biscuit boxes inside the perimeter. If the outer wall fell, the inner wall gave them somewhere to fall back to. The idea was that a smaller perimeter, however desperate, was better than a broken one. At around 4 in the afternoon, a contingent of Allied Natal native contingent troops stationed behind the nearby Oscarburg Hill, a rocky outcrop that rose above the station, began to withdraw. Their officer reported that his men would not hold. What followed made things worse. When a portion of the Natal native contingent at the barricades also turned and fled, the garrison's effective strength shrank from 400 men to approximately 150. The numbers that remained were almost entirely from Bromhead's B Company of the 24th Regiment, along with a handful of men from other units and some civilian employees. There was no time to debate this. The men who stayed took their positions at the walls and loaded their rifles. At roughly 4:30 in the afternoon of January 22, 1879, the Zulu force appeared on the far side of the station. The force that came over the ridge south of Rorke's Drift was part of what the Zulu army called the Undi Corps, sometimes referred to as the reserve, or the loins of the main army. These were warriors, mostly in their 30s, who had been held back during the Battle of Isandlwana and had not yet fought that day. They had marched more than 20 miles across rugged country since morning. They were not tired in any way that showed. Their commander was Dabulamanzi Kamampande, a half-brother of King Cetshwayo. Dabulamanzi had already crossed the Buffalo River into Natal, violating Cetshwayo's orders to stay within Zululand. Whether he did this out of personal ambition, or because he wanted to prevent the garrison from threatening the rear of his retreating forces, or simply because his warriors demanded a fight of their own, is a question historians have debated. What is not debated is that he came. The first assault hit the southern wall of the station and the front of the hospital simultaneously. Thousands of warriors charged the barricades in a wave, spreading out to attack on multiple sides at once. The British opened fire. The Martini Henry rifle was a powerful single-shot breech-loading weapon that fired a heavy .45 caliber round. At close range and in volume, it was devastating. The defenders fired steadily, controlled volleys from behind the mealie bags. The first charges were broken before they reached the wall. But there were too many warriors for rifle fire alone to hold. Some reached the barricades. Where they did, the fighting turned to hand-to-hand combat. Zulu warriors armed with stabbing spears and cowhide shields pressed against the chest-high wall, while soldiers above them fought with bayonets. The wall was not high enough to climb, so the Zulus crouched beneath it, slashing upward through the gaps, grabbing at rifle barrels, trying to drag men down. At several points along the north wall, warriors climbed onto each other to try to push over the barricade. They were driven back each time, but they kept coming. The sun began to go down. The fighting did not stop. Within the first 2 hours of the battle, it became clear that the north wall, the longest stretch of barricade, facing toward the hill and exposed to fire from the Oscarburg above, could not be held. Zulu sharpshooters had taken positions on the rocky slope and were firing down into the station. Men at the north wall were being shot from above as well as attacked from the front. At 6 in the evening, Chard ordered the north wall abandoned. The men fell back to the inner biscuit box redoubt, giving up the forward section of the yard and the front rooms of the hospital building. The hospital became the most desperate site of the battle. The building contained 36 patients, many of whom could not stand without help. As Zulu warriors pushed into the abandoned front rooms from the outside, the patients and their defenders could not simply retreat back through the building and out into the main yard. The internal layout of the hospital was a series of separate rooms, each separated by solid walls with locked doors. There was no open corridor from one end to the other. The men defending the hospital had to improvise their escape room by room. Private Henry Hook, a soldier with a reputation for being something less than obedient in peacetime, fought off Zulus in close quarters while his colleagues used pickaxes and bayonets to hack holes through the interior partition walls. Through those holes, the defenders passed the patients, some of them on hands and knees, some dragged, some carried, room by room toward the far end of the building and out into the yard. Private Joseph Williams held one position until he was dragged out through a window and killed. Private John Williams, no relation, held another doorway long enough for 11 patients to pass through the wall behind him. Private Robert Jones held yet another position and escorted the last patients out. The hospital roof caught fire during this fighting. Whether the Zulus set it deliberately or whether a burning brand from a cooking fire spread to the thatch is unclear, but the result was that the hospital burned while men were still inside it. The flames served as an enormous lantern over the battlefield, throwing orange light over the station and the surrounding ground. In one sense, this made the defenders more visible. In another, it made the approaches visible too, and the defenders used that light. Not all the patients were saved. Some were killed in their beds before they could be reached. By 8 or 9 in the evening, the garrison had consolidated around the storehouse and the stone cattle enclosure called the kraal. The inner biscuit box wall held. The men behind it were exhausted and some were wounded, but they were still there. The Zulu attacks continued through the night, wave after wave testing the walls in different places, probing for a gap that would give them the rush they needed. Each time, the defenders managed to hold. The Martini Henry rifles fired until the barrels grew too hot to touch, and then the soldiers kept firing. By the early hours of January 23rd, the British had fired through most of their 20,000 rounds of ammunition. A 600-round box and what remained in individual pouches was close to all that was left. Some historians believe that if the Zulus had mounted one more full assault in those pre-dawn hours, the wall would have broken. But the attacks grew less frequent as the night wore on. Around 4 in the morning, the last major assault came. The defenders held. Then there was quiet. Chard's men stayed at their positions. Nobody slept, nobody moved. The station was a ruin of broken crates and scattered equipment. The hospital was a burned shell. The ground outside the walls was covered with dead Zulu warriors. Inside, 17 men lay dead or dying. Almost every man in the garrison carried a wound of some kind. They waited in the silence, expecting another attack. None came. At 7 in the morning, a Zulu force appeared on the crest of the hill to the south. The exhausted defenders took their positions, certain that this was the final assault. They prepared to fire. The Zulus looked down at the station for a long moment. Then they withdrew. A few hours later, Lord Chelmsford arrived at Rorke's Drift with the survivors of his column, returning from Isandlwana. The battle was over. What Chelmsford found was a station that had held. The storehouse was intact. The yard behind the inner wall was intact. The men who had defended it were still on their feet, though many could barely stand. The count of Zulu dead around the station ran to somewhere between 400 and 600, with estimates varying across the historical record. Wounded warriors who survived the battle put total Zulu casualties in the hundreds more. The British lost 15 men killed in the fight, with 2 more dying of their wounds later, for a total of 17. Almost every survivor had been hit, cut, or burned. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded for the defense of Rorke's Drift, 7 of them to soldiers of the 24th Regiment. It was the most Victoria Crosses ever given for a single action to one regiment, and that record has never been broken. The citations covered Chard and Bromhead, Surgeon James Reynolds, who treated the wounded throughout the battle, Dalton himself, Corporal William Allen, Private Hook, Private John Williams, Private Robert Jones, Private William Jones, and several others whose specific acts of courage appear in the official reports. Some historians since have noted that the awards also served a political purpose. The British public received news of the disaster at Isandlwana a few weeks later, and the story of the 150 men at Rorke's Drift was a counterweight that Victoria's government badly needed. Whether this affected the decision to award 11 crosses rather than fewer is a question that cannot be answered cleanly. What can be said is that several of the men who received them did things during that night that fit the decoration by any standard. Private Joseph Williams, who was killed in the hospital, was noted in the official dispatches as someone who would have been recommended for the Victoria Cross had he lived. At the time, the award could not be given posthumously. The Zulu kingdom fought on for 5 more months. Chelmsford reorganized his forces and invaded again in the spring of 1879. A second British army, better prepared and better disciplined than the first, moved into Zululand with slower caution and stronger supply lines. At the Battle of Ulundi on July 4, 1879, a British square formation repelled the last major Zulu assault and then swept forward to destroy the royal military encampments. Cetshwayo fled and was captured in August. The Zulu kingdom was broken apart by the British into 13 separate territories under appointed chiefs, a deliberate fracturing of the political structure that had made the kingdom strong. Zululand was formally annexed as a British territory in 1887. For the men who had defended Rorke's Drift, the night of January 22nd left its mark in ways that did not end with dawn. Gonville Bromhead became withdrawn and difficult to reach after the battle. Fellow officers observed that he would go silent and remove himself whenever the action was mentioned in conversation. Private Robert Jones, one of the men who held the hospital rooms, was haunted for years by recurring nightmares of the hand-to-hand fighting inside. John Chard went on to a modest military career and died in 1897 at the age of 50. As for Rorke's Drift itself, the site was rebuilt after the battle. The hospital and storehouse were eventually reconstructed. A museum and a memorial cemetery now mark the ground where the fighting took place, with stones for both the British dead and the Zulu warriors who fell outside the walls. What is held at Rorke's Drift is not simply the memory of a defensive stand. It is the record of a decision, made in about 2 hours with incomplete information and no good options, by men who stayed when they could have run. Whether that decision produced heroism or tragedy or both at once depends on where you stand in the longer story of which Rorke's Drift was one night. The walls held. The men held. The night passed. That much is certain.